Looking through a microscope at a single drop of pond water is like discovering a new and mysterious world. A world inhabited by strange and wonderful creatures. In this program, we will learn to recognize a few of these creatures, find out how their bodies function, and discover the role some of them play in the creation of a pond water community. A single drop of pond water will almost always contain examples of organisms from 3 different kingdoms of living things: animal, mineran, and protist. Usually, the largest creatures in a drop of pond water are many-celled invertebrate animals, that is, animals without backbones. In a pond environment, these small invertebrates are usually secondary food consumers. That is, they consume tinier animals and protozoa for food, and they themselves become food for tadpoles and fish. Here are a few many-celled animals that can be found in a drop of pond water. The water flea called Daphnia, the one-eyed cyclops, worms, rotifers, and the immature or larval stages of many different animals. The smallest, and yet by far the most numerous creatures in a drop of pond water are bacteria. To see them clearly, the highest power of magnification on the microscope must be used. Bacteria, classified as members of the kingdom Minera, play an important role in the pond community by busily decomposing the dead remains of once living creatures. But besides being decomposers, bacteria are also a major source of food for many of the protozoa that are found in such huge numbers in pond environments. Protozoa, a word meaning first animals, are classified as members of the kingdom of protists. Protozoa are usually smaller than the many-celled invertebrate animals in a pond community. But protozoa are much larger than bacteria. Comparing bacteria and protozoa, we find that both are one-celled organisms. But a bacterial cell doesn't have a separate nucleus within its cytoplasm, while a protozoan cell will have one or more distinct nuclei within its cytoplasm. Later in this program, we will learn to recognize nuclei as well as other structures of protozoan cells. As a group, the protozoa have long provided biologists with a wonderful source of material for scientific study. The protozoa can be divided into 2 basic groups: those that are like animals and cannot make their own food, and those that are like plants and can make their own food by photosynthesis from sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide gas. Plant-like protozoa, also called algae, are major food producers in the pond community, and for this reason, many of the other life forms that dwell there depend on algae, either directly or indirectly, for their survival. When the algae are eaten, the energy they captured from the sun is passed on to the primary food consumers, usually animal-like protozoa. Even if an alga dies, the energy it captured from the sun while it was alive is still passed on to scavenging organisms that feed on the dead remains of once living things. But photosynthesis does even more than create food. It causes oxygen to be released into the environment. Most of the Earth's oxygen is created by one-celled algae. Animals could not exist without oxygen, which is needed for cellular respiration. During cellular respiration, the energy stored in food is released in order to keep an organism's life processes going. Because algae are important sources of both food and oxygen to other organisms, we will look at them in more detail. If you dip a stick into an algae-filled pond, you will find that some of the algae comes out in long threads. These threads are actually long groups of identical cells called cell colonies. One of the most common thread-like algae is called Spirogyra. Under the microscope, Spirogyra has a very unusual appearance because the chloroplasts inside the cells wind around and around in a beautiful spiral pattern. At a higher magnification, we can see these chloroplasts very clearly. Chloroplasts are the little organs or organelles where photosynthesis takes place. They are found in all protist algae and in higher plant cells. Animals and animal-like protists do not have chloroplasts. Besides Spirogyra, thread-like algae of many other types are also very commonly found in pond communities, where they shelter and feed all sorts of creatures. Another very common type of colony found in greenish water are the beautiful spinning spheres called volvox. Under a microscope at low power, we can see the smaller daughter colonies living inside the large mother colonies. At a certain stage of their lives, the mother colonies burst open and release the colonies of daughter cells to the water outside. The movement of a volvox colony is beautiful to watch. Each cell of the colony has a pair of whip-like projections called flagella that are wiggled in a well-coordinated way to move the colony through the water. It is not unusual to find the simpler cousins of volvox living with them in the same drop of water. With this group of creatures, each genus or type shows a step going from the simplest to the most complicated type of colony. The simplest types are just one-celled algae with flagella. Next are the four-celled colonies whose beating flagella can be seen very clearly here. Even more complicated are members of this genus that can form solid ball-shaped colonies of 16 identical cells. Then another type forms a small hollow sphere of about 32 cells. Finally, hundreds of identical cells can be found in the colonies of volvox. Biologists believe that the ability of cells to make colonies led to the formation of the many-celled creatures found in the kingdoms of plants, animals, and fungi. Another group of algae are called diatoms. They are very important as food and oxygen producers. Diatoms are recognized by the fact that their cells are covered with a hard mineralized coating. Diatoms can be found living both as colonies of identical cells and as slow-moving single-celled creatures of many different sizes, shapes, and colors. This organism, called a euglena, doesn't form colonies. It seems to be a link between the plant and animal worlds. The euglena we see here is green because it contains chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the chemical needed for photosynthesis that is found in all plants. When enough sunlight exists, a euglena can make its own food by photosynthesis just like a plant. But when light is not available, they can capture food just like animals. Mark the boxes on your answer sheet either true or false. Or fill in the blank when you hear the tone. True or false. Protist is just another word for protozoan. True or false. Diatoms like these produce oxygen. This organism is green because it contains a chemical called true or false. This water flea could not be a protist because its body is made up of many different kinds of cells. The volvox seen here is of identical cells. True or false? These whip-like cell projections called flagella are used mostly by cells for protection. True or false? Both these bacteria and these protozoa have cells with nuclei. True or false? Bacteria not only decompose the dead remains of once living things, they are also an important source of food for protozoa. True or false? The chloroplasts that wind around in these algal cells are the organelles where photosynthesis takes place. True or false? Diatoms are major food consumers in a food chain. Sometimes the line between animals and plants is even less clear than we saw in the euglena. Like most plants, this stentor is green in color. But a stentor does not behave like a plant at all. Instead, it actively uses its large cellular mouth for feeding. Under high magnification, it can be seen that this stentor's green color is really the result of many symbiotic algae living within its cytoplasm. The word symbiosis means two types of organisms living together. In this case, the stentor benefits by receiving food and oxygen from the algae, and the algae benefit because they are protected from hungry organisms in the outside environment. Like the stentor's mouth, protozoan cells can possess specialized structures that act like the noses, eyes, arms, and legs of many-celled organisms. For example, this creature called a dileptus extends out part of its cell like a long nose as it searches for food. And at the base of its nose is a mouth-like opening where food is taken into its cell. The red-colored eye spot we see in this euglena is a special area of its cell that functions like an eye. In more complicated creatures, eyes are made up of millions of cells. Because they are simple structures, eye spots can only tell light from dark, and cannot tell one shape from another. And finally, the bristles on the side of this protozoan called a euploides move in ways that remind us of the arms or legs of more complex animals. They are very useful in capturing food. The animal-like protozoa take food into their single cells in several different ways. One of the most common ways of feeding uses short beating hairs called cilia. One way that cilia are used in feeding can be understood by watching a stentor feed. As the cilia that surrounds its gaping mouth rapidly beat the water, whirlpools are created that pull in food, just like water being pulled down a drain. These stentors' method of feeding appears to be very effective because they can grow to be quite large compared to most other protists. Another protozoan that uses cilia to capture food is called a vorticella. A vorticella is a creature that lives attached by a muscular stalk to underwater objects. From wherever it is attached, a vorticella can twirl around the water as it creates a powerful whirlpool that sucks tiny algae, small protozoa, and bacteria into its large open mouth. If a vorticella senses danger, it can shorten its stalk and quickly disappear from view. Of all the protozoa that feed with the help of cilia, the paramecia seen here are usually the most common in pond environments. Under high magnification, the cilia can be seen beating around the oral groove that makes up part of the paramecium's mouth. Once bacteria or diatoms are drawn inside of the paramecium, tiny sacs called food vacuoles form. Digestion takes place inside of these food vacuoles, which act almost like a human stomach. After nutrient chemicals have been extracted from the food, waste material is ejected from the food vacuoles into the surrounding water. Like many other protists, this paramecium also has a pair of contractile vacuoles that can be seen slowly filling with water from inside the cell, and then pumping it to the outside. By doing this, the contractile vacuoles control the cell's water content, just like kidneys control the water content in the human body. Beneath the paramecium's outer skin, or pellicle, is a layer called the cell or plasma membrane. The plasma membrane has an important role to play in the life of every cell by regulating much of what enters and leaves the cell. Many paramecia have two nuclei within their cells. One is large and is called a macronucleus. The other, almost impossible to see, is small and is called a micronucleus. The micronucleus is important in cell reproduction, and the macronucleus controls the cell's day-to-day functions. This protozoan, called an amoeba, has no definite body shape, and its nucleus can be very clearly seen. It feeds by sending out projections of its cell called pseudopods or false feet. An amoeba uses its pseudopods to surround and capture food, a feeding method called phagocytosis. Human white blood cells use this same feeding method when destroying bacteria that cause disease. In an amoeba, just as in a paramecium, food vacuoles are formed for digestion. And once digestion is completed, these vacuoles empty waste to the outside of the cell. In protozoa, feeding structures like pseudopods can also play an important role in movement or locomotion. Using a method of locomotion called amoeboid movement, an amoeba can slide over surfaces by extending its pseudopods, and then pulling the rest of its cell along behind. Paramecia move by wiggling the cilia that covers the surface of their cells. This ciliary movement can result in very rapid locomotion. This protozoan, called a didymium, is sometimes seen spinning around inside of a drop of water, as it rapidly moves the rows of cilia that ring its body. Even a stentor can swim through the water by wiggling the same cilia it uses for feeding. Or it can even walk by extending out the base of its cell, and then pulling the rest behind. As we saw earlier, many plant-like protists use long whip-like flagella to propel themselves through the water. This method of locomotion, called flagellar movement, is even found in the sperm cells of advanced animals. Protozoa can reproduce by two basic methods. The first method, called asexual reproduction, takes place when one parent cell divides into two new cells. Here we see two vorticellas. The one that remains standing is just beginning to undergo asexual reproduction, and the other is not. Asexual reproduction begins when the parent cell duplicates its genetic material called DNA, the chemical material its genes are made of. Then the genetic material is passed into the two newly forming cells. Gradually, a new cell membrane forms and the cells start to separate. Soon the new cells begin to throb, and for the first time they can be recognized as vorticellas. Once cell division is completed, the rings of cilia around their mouths start beating, and they begin their new lives as two separate living creatures. The second method of reproduction is called sexual reproduction. In this case, genetic material is exchanged between the two parent cells, as we see happening here with these mating strands of algae. Organisms resulting from sexual reproduction have a better chance of survival than those resulting from asexual reproduction, because the new organisms resulting from sexual reproduction have genes from a larger gene pool than could be obtained from just one parent. Observing protozoa is a fascinating way to learn a lot about biology. We can learn how cells are structured and how they function by closely examining these simple one-celled organisms, because even human cells are not very much different from the cells of protozoa. By studying samples of pond water under a microscope, it is possible to witness the miracle of new life awakening as cells divide. Or learn about the food chain by watching a stentor feed. Without a doubt, the protozoa are some of nature's simplest, most diverse, and most fascinating creatures. Mark the boxes on your answer sheet either true or false. Or fill in the blank when you hear the tone. True or false. A separate nucleus like the one we see in this amoeba would never be found in the cells of plants or animals. True or false. Nuclei control most of the activities of cells, from how they use food to how they reproduce. The sacs formed in the cytoplasm of this paramecium after it takes in food are called vacuoles. This amoeba has a unique method of locomotion called movement. True or false? This didymium moves by wiggling little hair-like structures called cilia. The light-sensitive area of red on the surface of this euglena is called an True or false? This organism, called a stentor, is green because it has algae cells living inside its body. True or false? This protist, called a vorticella, feeds in a much different way from a stentor. True or false? Simple cell division involving only one parent cell is an asexual method of reproduction. True or false? These mating strands of algae are reproducing sexually.